I decided to do this, I guess a couple weeks ago after having a conversation with my husband, and with all of the things going on in the world at the moment, it just seems like things are really heavy. And things have been pretty heavy since March. So it feels necessary to talk about and remind ourselves about the importance of joy. And then ironically, I had such a hard time finishing the slide. First of all, I started way too big and had way too much in it. So I've already decided I'll do a different didactic blitz on a different day about just joy in work and what are some of the barriers and ways that we can enhance joy in work. But that felt too much to do just today. And then I kind of got myself onto a bit of a rabbit hole based on a quote that I've heard in the past on a podcast that I listened to. The quote was from Brittany Packnett, and she's on a podcast called Pod Save the People, and she talked about how for the Black community, sometimes joy is an act of protest, because if you're being oppressed, your oppressors don't want you to experience joy, and so therefore the expression of joy can be an act of protest and a really radical act. But then I really got myself into a weird rabbit hole, and when I was trying to finish up slides last night, my husband looked at him, he's like, it's like you've managed to somehow almost go too far. Like you have this idea, but then you're doing a didactic about joy, but you're bringing in so much of the things that suck the joy out of your life. I said, yeah, that's really true too. So I've had to take a couple steps back with this, which is such a weird thing for me to process. And thanks for just kind of letting me process that while I'm pulling this up today. There is a long list of citations at the end because I want to demonstrate that there is a good amount of literature on this. In fact, probably too much, because you find literature from joy of work and joy of practice. Then there's the stuff on more the philosophical end, and a whole lot of literature around what is joy versus happiness, in that realm of the world. And then there's everything in the world of religion and spirituality. So some of this is definitely backed by literature, and there you could see that from the citation, but some of it to some degree I decided I need to just kind of trust my own gut with where I wanted to go with it. So I'm not claiming to be an expert, but this is something that I think we all need, and I decided to put a little bit more of myself into it than I maybe always allow. So as I typically do, I like to start with just the definition of a joy. And it's funny to look it up because it's hard to find a consistent definition. If you consider, all right, using my Mac is sometimes weird. If you consider joy versus happiness, depending on which side of the spectrum of literature you're looking at, it's either looked at as joy is the fleeting thing, the thing that you can't, it's kind of spontaneous, and happiness is kind of this longer term, like a sense of contentment. And then other literature says the exact opposite. The reality is that they're very similar, they're very related. We use these terms interchangeably to some degree. And from the more Buddhist philosophy, they look at joy as something, as really an attitude and something that you can absolutely cultivate and grow within your life, whereas happiness they consider more of it's just a fleeting emotion like anger or sadness or fear. But happiness is something that comes and goes in the waves of the world, but joy is something that is really a sense of deep satisfaction and an ultimate bigger goal, but something that you carry with you even in the midst of an immediate feeling that is sometimes contrary. So you can experience joy in your life while also experiencing fear or sadness in the moment. So part of the reason that joy is so important is because it actually is important to our physical bodies. When we feel joy, our bodies release dopamine and serotonin. People who rate high on the optimism scale show lower rates of cardiac-related diseases. People who rate high on hopefulness and curiosity, there seems to be some protective effects against hypertension, diabetes, upper respiratory infection. And getting back into kind of the philosophical piece of it, the Dalai Lama says that hope and joy and happiness are all beneficial to our health, and really believes that our physical and mental health depend on having a happy or joyful state of mind. The other reason that it's important to talk about joy is when you look at what happens in the absence of it. So in the absence of joy, people experience suffering, insecurity, fear, and when suffering, people tend to experience an absence of joy. You could see it in depression rates and how the impact of racism, sexism, and oppression does suck joy away from people. So Black Americans are 30% more likely to report having serious psychological distress. Women more likely to experience depression and anxiety throughout their lifetime. You see poverty being an area where there's a real absence of joy. And when you look at it within ethnic groups compared to those living below the poverty level versus above the poverty level, those living below are more likely to report serious psychological distress. You see an absence of joy with violence, neglect, and the loss of community. And we're constantly bombarded by so much negativity right now, particularly right now. Things that really do suck the joy out of you. How many of us can look at the news or social media for more than 5 minutes without feeling like something's being drained from us? And it's interesting because the word compassion comes from the Latin word to suffer with. And yet we know that compassion and to suffer with a person also has detrimental effects on us as providers. We've talked about compassion fatigue before, and how it relates to burnout, and so much of the way that our current political climate, social climate, even the culture within medicine really sets us all up to potentially suck the joy out of life, even when we're trying to add to it by demonstrating compassion. I've also heard people talk about trauma being something that kind of traps us in the present. And when you're trapped in the present, you can't really think creatively. You lose that ability to imagine things being able to be different. I'm kind of combining a little bit of quotes, but if you can't imagine things being different, then you can't see things being different tomorrow. So despair really becomes believing that tomorrow will be just like today. Well, the flip side of that is that hope is believing that tomorrow can be better than today. So I see hope and compassion as really the road to putting more joy back in our life. And I've inserted a couple quotes throughout this. The Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu have a wonderful book that I highly recommend called The Book of Joy. So there's a couple of their quotes throughout this. The Dalai Lama talks about the more you spend time thinking about yourself, the more suffering you experience. So that's where that compassion comes in, that if we can demonstrate compassion while also managing to not dive into compassion fatigue, we will experience more joy. So from the Buddhist lens, there are 8 pillars of joy. And I think what's kind of cool about it is if you look at it from the Buddhist, so they have these 8 pillars, but all of these things very much align with the literature from both philosophy and actually the literature from healthcare on what helps us feel more joy. So perspective would be, considering your attitudes, your values, your beliefs, considering that we're all interconnected and we're all impermanent, so we should cherish everything that we have in front of us. And also a reminder that our perspective is really narrow. It's only one view. Humor is one of my favorite ways of pulling joy into my life, and it's tremendously important. Studies on humor show that laughter boosts your immune system. It can relax your body. It lowers your stress hormones, which cause inflammation. It can be a respite from pain. And having the ability to find humor in any situation really is therapeutic. And being able to not take everything or ourselves too seriously. Humility, I think about narrative humility, and this ties into perspective. So if we keep in mind that our perspective is very narrow because it's only ours, and we approach things from a humble standpoint, using cultural humility and narrative humility, accepting that I can't know every possible thing about the other person in front of me, but I certainly want to try. Acceptance. So acceptance that life is what it is and that suffering is a natural part of life, but also without resigning. Acceptance doesn't mean you give up or that you stop trying to make things better, that you don't try to change things that you can, but acceptance that this is how life is at the moment nonetheless. Oh. Sorry, folks. My family just got home from the dentist, and the dogs are very excited. Forgiveness, which forgiveness doesn't mean that so what happened was okay, or whatever you need to forgive was okay. It doesn't give people permission to behave however they want to, but it removes the anger and sadness to be temporary, and it allows us to not be stuck and attached to feelings from the past and trying to change the past. Gratitude, there's some people within the Buddhist realm that talk about the root of joy being in gratefulness. And it's not the joy that makes us grateful, it's that gratitude makes us joyful. So expressing gratitude and even having gratitude expressed towards us. Compassion, so being able to see that others are suffering and wanting to take an active step in changing that suffering and to reduce their suffering. And generosity, going back to that previous quote, the more time you spend thinking about yourself, the more suffering you will experience. But the opposite is also true, that the more time you spend on the well-being of others and giving to others, the more joy you bring into your life. So things that we can do to amplify joy, because if joy is important, we want to make sure that we are doing stuff that is going to bring more joy into our life. So there was the 8 pillars. There's also just some basic things that I think are important to keep in mind. So people who are experiencing more joy, or when they experience more joy they have, they did, connections, meaningful connections, personal relationships. When it comes to patients, having that doctor-patient or counselor-patient relationship, but being able to focus on the people and not so much around all of this other stuff, not having to focus on, the business side of things, but focusing on that human connection. Having a sense of personal mission, a sense of purpose, and being able to do things that drive our purpose and that help us to achieve some of that sense of purpose. Focusing on your passion. What is it that gets you really amped up? What are you excited about? What are the things that are more work but you feel more energized afterwards? Opportunities to learn and grow. Personal growth and having the autonomy to learn new things, learn new people, is absolutely correlated with joy. I put in this hashtag because it came up in the COVID echo on Wednesday, hashtag I need a minute, because sometimes we do just need a minute. You've got to take a break. So if it's putting social media down, stepping away from the news, stepping away from what's going on in the world, or stepping away from patients because you're getting frustrated, or a colleague because you're getting frustrated, you have to take a step back. We do still have to focus on ourselves. We have to be healthy in order to give to other people. So having that balance of being able to be well in order to give to others. Another quote from the Book of Joy is that you show your happiness by how you see not how you see yourself as apart from others, but how you are connected to others. So really focusing on this, where we find joy is where we find connection, and where we find our ability to create connections and bolster relationships. It's difficult to be happy and to feel joyful in the face of crisis and uncertainty and pandemic and all of the things that have been going on with demonstrations and persistent systemic violence and systemic racism, but they're so important. It's important for us to focus on those things that are positive, to focus on those relationships that matter and that bring us joy and bring us connection. It's important to focus on the things that we're grateful for and the things that we appreciate, no matter how big or small. I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and they were talking about how when you really think, if you take a moment to really consider what is it that I appreciate most. Many people often go to their family, their family, friends, kids, spouse, work, pets, but sometimes maybe it's just that cup of coffee. Maybe it's appreciating to have a moment for yourself. Maybe it's being able to go run or ride your bike. Whatever it is that brings light and positivity into your life, those things are things that we need to focus on. And there's this great 10-chapter series that was put out by the AASP online. There is a link to it in the citations, but it's Quotes from the Edge of Nowhere, the Art of Noticing Unnoticed Life Wisdom. And this was one of the quotes that I really loved in it. The louder I give love, the more I will experience the immeasurable reverberating joy of a life well lived. And so if there's any take-home message in this, it's to love one another and focus on the positive and to take care of one another. And that's it.